Hello there and happy Thursday. Welcome to today's Fireside Chat. I'm really excited to have one of my colleagues with me, Slavina, who will be talking to us about a very exciting topic that I hope that you will stay tuned into, and that is artificial intelligence or AI. Slavina has done incredible work in the UK, and she'll be talking to us about some of her work around the EU regulations and as it relates to AI, and also what she's doing here at Harvard Kennedy School. Slavina, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. Thank you for your time and thank you for being with me today.
Thank you for having me, Shaniqua. It's really a pleasure.
Yes, absolutely. I'm really excited. We've talked in class. We in fact share a course together that we just ended, where I've always admired your comments, by the way, around just our technological and societal clashes that we've been studying over the last semester. So it's been great to be in class with you.
You're too kind because I could say the same, and I really just admire all the work that you're doing with I Raise Girls and Boys. So thank you for also introducing me to your cause and all the work that you're doing on AI and equity. I think it's really fascinating.
Thanks, Lavina. And to all those that are listening, we want you to do us a favor and share this message out so that we can amplify the messages around AI to our communities, our networks, and our families. I think this is a very crucial and critical topic, especially in today's world. And then coming up in our new year, 2025, we'll see a lot of changes drastically as it relates to AI and governance and education and other industries. So please tune in and share this message out. All right, I'm going to jump into Slavina's bio and then we'll get started with our first question. Slavina Anchiva is pursuing a master in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School as a Fulbright Bulgaria scholar and Belfer Young Leader. During her time at the Kennedy School, Slavina is focusing on tech policy and its impact on democracy, especially in the field of artificial intelligence. Prior to the Harvard Kennedy School, Slavina worked in the European Parliament for 4 years as a policy advisor and head of officer for the member of the European Parliament, Eva Maydell. Slavina led MEP Maydell's work on the Artificial Intelligence Act, the world's first ever comprehensive law on AI. She also led the work on the EU Digital Services Act, coordinated the efforts of a team based in both Brussels and Bulgaria, and spearheaded the transatlantic efforts and engagements of MEP Maydell. In Bulgaria, Slavina is also the co-founder of the NGO Accessible World, focusing on disability rights and accessibility of public spaces. I love that. Slavina, I'm really interested in, before going into our first question, to learn more about what got you started into the field of artificial intelligence. And also, as a follow-up, can you tell us a little more about how you landed as a member of the European Parliament?
Yeah, of course. In my undergraduate degree, I studied economics and political science. And at the time, I was just super fascinated, mainly in the field of international relations, disinformation, information warfare, and kind of how technology can shape great power competition. Halfway through college, I was looking for internships, and I am originally from Bulgaria. So I looked to Bulgaria, to Europe, and I found the member of the European Parliament who I ended up working for, Eva Majdal. She is a Bulgarian member of the European Parliament, focusing mainly on digital technologies and technology regulation. She's very young, she's active, she's a role model for me. So since that first internship, I knew that that was where I wanted to be. So after I finished my undergraduate studies, I started working with the team full time, and I spent the last 4 years there as a policy advisor on some of the laws that you mentioned, which we are very proud of in the EU because they're really setting the standards for democratic governance of technologies. So I really enjoyed that time, and especially our work on the EU artificial intelligence law, which is the first in the world. And I'm sure we'll get to speak about that today as well.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I'm most excited about hearing is the EU. I am so fascinated by the work that the European Parliament has done around AI, especially being really at the forefront of this work. So many lessons to learn for us in the US. You've had extensive experience in shaping AI governance and policy. I'm wondering if you can speak to what do you see as some of the most pressing challenges in regulating AI and balancing innovation. And it also because we have audiences that are may not know what we're may not understand some of these words that we're using. If you can explain them in maybe the most basic terms, um, as well as probably provide a little more understanding around what artificial intelligence is for those that may be still growing in their knowledge of AI.
Absolutely, absolutely. Of course, maybe to start with that, so artificial intelligence has definitely become this buzzword in recent years. Everyone's talking about it. Not everyone knows what it is. I mean, even you'd be surprised, like there's different understandings of the term even within the community. When we speak back home to people in Bulgaria, when we're explaining the work that we do, we like to say it's already here. I mean, artificial intelligence is what's powering algorithm that's deciding what you see on Facebook. It's what's powering the map instructions you're getting from Google Maps, for example. So it's something that we've all been interacting with. It's just that now it's advanced quite rapidly, and we see that especially with the introduction of chatbots like ChatGPT, Gemini, Bard, and so on. So in terms of how we think about regulating such a fast-moving technology, and of course, speaking from my former role, I'm no longer there, but when we speak about regulating, it's really just putting laws in place to make sure that the way that these technologies continue to develop is done in a way that's in line with our democratic values, with respect for human rights, for human dignity, equality. Just because a technology is new doesn't mean that our laws no longer apply. So we want to make sure that we're staying up to date, essentially. And of course, that's really hard because these AI is, something new is happening every single day. So how do you make a law that's going to last for a few years beyond that? And it's exactly this balance that I think is very difficult. We often hear people speak about the balance between regulation and innovation. What does that mean? We want to benefit from the positive uses of this technology. So AI, for example, and advances in this type of technology and learning can help us with medicine or research, can help us live longer, live healthier lives, happier lives. And that's the positive side of it. But it could also have negative impacts. It can decide if a person is eligible to get a loan in a bank. It can decide if someone is going to be hired to work at a certain job. So we want to make sure that we're finding that sweet spot in the middle where you're putting just enough rules in place to still get the positive benefits, but to mitigate those potential negative effects that it could have on the lives of people.
It's so well said. And to that, you mentioned a few things that really stood out to me around AI can really determine sort of our way forward in society and dealing with some of our complex challenges that we have not yet been able to solve, namely around areas of equity or an injustice, whether it be credit lending or whether it be education. I'm wondering if you can speak a little to how AI may either exasperate our existing problems in society that we've not yet been able to deal with. And then on the flip side, what are some ways that AI can, in fact, help move us forward in areas where we have been stuck as a society, especially in areas of equity?
Absolutely. I think you phrased that super well. We like to say AI doesn't necessarily create these new problems. I mean, a lot of times these are problems that already existed in society. We talk about this in class. There's society clashes that are just exposed by a new technology. So let's take the credit loan example that you mentioned. I think that's a very pertinent case. So at a bank, if the certain bank official is using an AI system to decide if a person gets approved for a loan or not, they're going to have to rely on existing data to somehow make that decision. That's how the system will work and make that decision. So if that data is based on historically biased data that disadvantages certain communities from a certain neighborhood, from a certain racial group, from a certain gender, then the AI cannot magically fix that data. The AI that's being used is going to continue perpetuating those biases unless you put rules in place. And those are the rules that we put in with the European Union AI law. We said if you're using AI for these very risky situations like credit loans, you have to make sure that the data is quality, that it's not going to discriminate against people, and that you take measures to address that. So I think that's one side of it. In terms of how it can help us advance, I mean, there is massive potential here. So I mentioned medicine. If there's certain diseases that affect certain groups more than others, women more than men, for example, or vice versa, you can have AI that's helping you do research in those areas, especially in diseases that are maybe less common. AI can also be used to help detect fraud, for example, to make sure that there's justice in the world. It can be used to help in a courtroom, and to help people make better decisions in courtrooms. But again, all those advances, you have to make sure that you have proper guardrails in place when you're using AI in these very sensitive sectors, which are very close to people's lives. They're, making decisions about us in a way. So you want to always make sure that there's a person there overseeing it, knowing what's going on, utilizing the benefits of it, but able to step in if needed.
And well spoken, Slovena. And it really, I'm thinking of a number of other society technology clashes that have come up for us, especially in Dr. Sweeney's course, where we talked about other clashes that have come up in society, whether it be through predictive analysis. I'm wondering if you can give us another example of how this may be relevant to those that are watching everyday lives, in terms of a clash that may be more close to home or visible for them.
Yeah, absolutely. A few examples come to mind, and I'm kind of going back to a bit of the work that we did in Europe. But for example, I mentioned the bank example, the credit loans, but you also nowadays have AI systems that are maybe being used in schools. So to decide if a child gets access to maybe some sort of gifted program or some sort of vocational training. The most obvious example of AI being used in schools is, of course, generative AI chatbots. And I'm sure a lot of the parents and teachers watching will have experience with this as children become very familiar with these technologies and start to use them more and more. And that can have a lot of positive impacts in terms of equalizing opportunities. And I'm sure you know more about this than me, by providing resources to students from disadvantaged backgrounds. But it could also sort of exacerbate these inequalities. So if there are certain schools with access to these technologies or with access to computers that other schools might not have access to, will those children then be better prepared for the workforce? So I think there's a lot of interesting and difficult questions around schools. Another example that we spoke about in class and have also worked on in the law in Europe is biometric facial recognition. I mean, a lot of these algorithms have been shown to just not always be as able to distinguish if a person, how they look, if they're, for example, coming from a disadvantaged background, or if someone is Black or from a different racial minority. So we have to make sure that the systems that we're using, especially for something like facial recognition, which is extremely invasive, are able to be equitable. And I think that's a lot of the work that you're doing. And actually, in Europe, we have banned the use of these systems, except in a few rare cases like terrorism, kidnapping of a child, and some extenuating circumstances. But for the most part, we want to make sure we strike that right balance between privacy and security, and respect for people's rights.
I think it's so incredible what you've done and what Europe is doing again and leading the way. And I'm really at all every time I hear the fact that facial recognition has been banned except in those cases, and I'm like wondering what that will look like in the U.S. or if it would ever make we will ever make that level of progression here. I guess in that respect, I'm probably a little skeptical. Um, but I'm wondering what was the process of, I'm sure there was a lot of pushback with these large tech companies and your work in regulating AI. What was the driving force behind it? And what were some of the sort of obstacles that you all faced in developing the EU AI Act?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And just to come back quickly on the biometric recognition, I think it's an extremely difficult question, right? Because for some of those situations, like the kidnapping of a child, I personally believe you should be able to use it. So I think it's about finding different ways to balance the necessity and the safety with the potential for downsides. And that also relates to your question on the process overall. I mean, we had immense interest, just being the first ones in the world to do this. I think we interacted with hundreds of stakeholders, I mean, companies, industry associations, but also a lot of NGOs, a lot of civil society groups, groups that are also trying to make sure that their ideas make it into the final text. So it goes back to balance. It's how do you make sure that the companies that are doing interesting work and developing the products that we do enjoy using can continue doing what they're doing, but not in a way that's going to be harmful to people, or that's going to like over concentrate their positions in the market. We have other laws for that as well. So I think it's trying to understand where everyone's coming from, trying to understand what their perspective is, what their potential own biases could be, and then having like the knowledge and the filter to kind of be able to say, this makes sense and this is good for the people that the member who I worked for is representing, and then she would ultimately make the call, like politically, what is acceptable for society and what is not.
Again, very fascinated by the work. Wondering that leading me to my next question around, I think people's fear that the AI may be replacing or displacing many or thousands of people in the work in the labor market. And I think in many respects, maybe this has already started happening in certain industries where a lot of jobs are being replaced by AI. So with that, given that AI is expected to disrupt industries and essentially redefine the way we work, the way certain industries are operating, in your opinion, I'm wondering how can government and institutions prepare workers for this type of reimagining? And I guess also I'm thinking of sectors such as nonprofits that may be like at the very bottom of the totem pole in this work. How could we prepare for this type of transformation? How could we be at the forefront, if we can, for this type of disruption that is inevitable?
Absolutely. And I think it really depends on the industry, right? I think the initial expectation was that you would have a lot of blue collar jobs, for example, being replaced. We're now seeing that that's not necessarily the case. Plenty of so-called white collar jobs, people working in offices, administrative buildings might also, we're even seeing studies about doctors who are now trying to understand how to best integrate AI into their work, and lawyers. So I think it's really going to be felt across the field. I'm not an expert, so I can't speak to what extent it's already happening, to what extent it will happen. I think there's plenty of people out there doing really good work on that. But certainly it will change the way we work. And I've often heard it said, it's not necessarily that AI will replace humans, but people who know how to use AI who will replace those who maybe are not using it as well. So it's all about equipping ourselves, understanding what it is, and developing the skills to work with these technologies. So what can governments do is implement nationwide digital literacy programs, skills programs. The problem in the sector is like everyone's always talking about it, and then you kind of have the same conversations over and over again. So I think the EU has made a lot of good progress in this space, but we still have like very vast regional inequalities in terms of digital literacy back in Europe, and I know it's the same in the US as well. So it's about continuing to work at that, finding good ways to measure that work. But there's a huge role for private sector and for nonprofits. I mean, I've seen a lot of companies that are sponsoring different kind of trainings, initiatives, coding, boot camps, hackathons, skills developing programs. I think that's great. It's a great example of public-private partnerships. And same goes for the NGOs. I think a lot of the work that you all are doing with the youngest generation, with students, equipping them for the future, that's extremely important. So I think it'll be a whole of society effort, as cliche as that sounds, making sure that people are ready for these changes, and that it can also, hopefully, if done right, make their jobs more fulfilling. But I say that with a caution, because it's not for sure. We have to work hard to be able to get there.
It's so you're speaking about so many great things in one. one of the things that I'm thinking about is the digital divide of AI, which we talked about before we went live today, briefly, on the topic of the how communities of color or vulnerable communities may not have an understanding, or um, there is a huge growing knowledge gap between those that are in communities of color around how to use AI. I believe there was a study, and I don't have the study from the top of my head right now, that was done on those that are in higher income brackets and those that are in more professional careers were able to use AI at better levels, or at greater levels than those that were not. So, speaking to the divide in AI, I'm wondering what are some ways, and I think you spoke to them already, literacy programs with the government, that we can close that divide more immediately so we can stop talking and start doing the work. So, what are some things that you would recommend that governments and nonprofits can do together to close that divide?
No, that's a great question. And again, I really think you're the expert on this here. But just from like a policy making side, I think there's plenty of initiatives that can be done in this space. A lot of it comes down to resources and funding. So if you want a change to happen, you have to be able to allocate the funding for it. And I think in Europe we have a whole range of programs that are carried out largely by the major European Union level, but they're implemented in small communities. So you have communities that are applying for these grants to then go on and carry out programs that they believe are beneficial, whether it be for reducing a digital divide, helping disadvantaged communities, vulnerable communities. And that's not to say that the burden should be on the communities themselves, but I think it is a very good model for allocating resources and making sure that the initiatives that you're funding are sustainable, because there has to be also a certain bottoms up element to this. And I think if there were to be a very knowledgeable NGO on an area that's saying, I have a project, I know how to make it work, I know the right people, I just need funding. And you have a very thorough review process of that. I think that's a good way to implement those changes going forward. But then again, a lot of it also goes back to the governments and what are they prioritizing. So is the respective Secretary of Education or Ministry of Education in Europe able to put programs in place taking into account regional disparities? So do they have the ability to measure those disparities beyond just test scores, but like a more holistic measure? And then based on that, to be able to say, okay, we should probably be investing more in this school or in this program, and thereby helping communities get ahead who have been traditionally disadvantaged. In Bulgaria, I do a bit of work, as you mentioned, with the disability rights community, a very vulnerable population, especially when we're speaking about new technologies like AI. So we put a few provisions in place for that in the EU AI law to make sure that a lot of these technologies and interfaces continue to be accessible for everyone. And that's just one small example of that.
That's incredible. I'm wondering how the EU is measuring impact of the EU Act, EU AI Act. What type of impacts or metrics have the EU been able to examine or trends over time since the EU? I know it's still very new, but since
Yeah.
the EU AI Act, has there been any particular case studies or any metrics that have been examined across time since the implementation of the act?
That's a great question. So as you say, it's still fairly new. So the act was adopted, this summer essentially. So it's coming into force and it's starting to be implemented. We have a whole new AI office actually set up in Brussels that's tasked with making sure that it's implemented well, that everyone's doing their jobs essentially in the AI space. But I think going backwards a little bit, before the law was even introduced almost 5 years ago, there's like a 500-page report online you can read, which is called an impact assessment. And that's meant to say, okay, if we introduce this law, what will it do? What will it do to the business community? What will it do to this community? So that's kind of like the pre-work before putting the law in. Now that it's already being implemented, there's going to be consistent reports coming from the main European Commission, which is like our executive branch, that's going to be reporting to the parliament, the legislator, on the work it's doing, on the impact it's having, and the law can then be updated. So that's like a more holistic measure. But I do know the AI office is now doing very good work in this space and trying to work a lot with stakeholders from all over, business, NGO, academia, to make sure that the way they're putting the law in place is reasonable, and that it makes sense. Because you can write one thing down, but it's all about how it actually gets put into action after.
Absolutely. And I'm really excited to continue following the work. I know that the act was just enacted a few months ago. So
Yeah.
I do believe that I do believe also once we start seeing some of those positive trends and impacts that perhaps the U.S. will be able to learn some lessons from your work. Can you speak to if you were to be able to take what you've done in the EU and bring it to the US? What would that look like for us, and where would you start?
I think that's really hard, right? Because as much as I want to say, just do it all the same way, I also don't think that's realistic for the U.S. context. I think there's a very different set of values here, a very different history, and also a very different ongoing political reality. I mean, of course, with the new administration, but even before that, with the deadlock that we were seeing in Congress on the issue. I do think there's a lot of very thoughtful people in Congress working on these issues, and each of them is maybe interested in different aspects of this. Like some are more interested in anti-discrimination, others are more interested in the market power component, the national security component. So I think there is some good work going on, some good legislation being introduced. There's the new AI Safety Institute working in DC. So progress has been made under the previous administration. Um, if I were to be giving my personal opinion on what could come next, I don't see how a major comprehensive law comes into being, just being realistic. Um,
Yes.
but I do think there's a lot of low hanging fruit there that could be tackled. So things like child safety online is actually now getting sort of like another resurgence potentially in Congress. Also, things like deepfake pornography, child sexual abuse material. I mean, these are issues that you can imagine members across the aisle can easily agree on. So I think it's about starting with those basics. Also, things like investment in AI science and research tends to be a more bipartisan issue, and building up from there to the more difficult questions, which eventually will also have to be addressed. But it's about giving some of the legislators confidence, some of the agencies confidence to act on these matters. And of course, here it's going to have to be not just a government effort, but again, a whole of society effort. So we're going to need to have hopefully the NGOs involved in the academia and the tech companies as well. I mean, they're all based here. So I think it's going to be very different. But I do think there is some potential to tackle at least some of the lower hanging fruits for the time being.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. Another thought that I've been pondering, Slovenia, has been this idea of tech policy and tech innovation integrating
Mhm.
within democracy and democratic processes. Oftentimes, when we're thinking about governance and innovation, they are on the opposite end of the spectrum. But I do believe there is a way, and I think it's necessary we find out or we figure out how to blend or integrate innovation into our governance structure because our world is evolving to now require such. Um,
Absolutely. And there's actually some really interesting programs happening in Congress now. I think they should probably be expanded. But things like Tech Congress, where they bring in young technologists to help legislative offices deliver better services for people, I think that's great. I mean, I've heard of stories of websites being made more accessible, for passengers flying with disabilities, for example. So I think that's the kind of ways you can use AI and technology more broadly to show people that democracy works and it delivers for you.
Absolutely. That leads me into my actual last question for you, and that's around your NGO, Accessible World, that you're a co-founder of. Seems like you've been doing incredible work in Brussels with Accessible World, and getting 3 projects successfully implemented. Wondering if you can speak more to your NGO and some of the work that you've been doing with Accessible World.
No, thank you. That's very kind. The whole idea for Accessible World came up. I grew up in the U.S. Despite being from Bulgaria. I grew up in a part of the U.S. close to D.C. where there were actually incredible public schools and really good access to services for people with disabilities, which I know is maybe not the case throughout the entire U.S., but in certain regions it is. And I just remember being in awe of some of the services provided, from the physical accessibility to the specialists working at these schools. So moving back to Bulgaria now, almost 4 years ago, there was just a desire to kind of bring some of that spirit and energy back and to do something meaningful back home. So we started a very small NGO. It's all donation based, and essentially it's action oriented. So you see a problem and we just go and fix it. I mean, there's the first example, we built an apartment ramp in a building in Sofia where the man with the wheelchair who lived inside could not exit his own building. So with the ramp, he now can. We built a playground, like a sensory path in an orphanage, equipped with a wheelchair accessible seesaw, which is pretty cool. And
Wow.
also the first accessible beach path in Bulgaria. So people with disabilities can enter the water on this chair that's equipped for it. So there's just a few examples, but we're proud of it because it is donation based. I mean, definitely looking to scale up. I think a lot of great things to learn from you and the wonderful work that iRaise Girls and Boys is doing. So we're excited for it, and we're excited to think about how we can incorporate accessibility more broadly. So like a lot of the digital accessibility that we spoke about now, education. I mean, there's plenty of fields to kind of expand into. So we're looking forward for that.
That is so incredible, Slovena. I'm astounded by your work and what you've been able to accomplish over the last few years, especially in your home.
I could say
Being
the
able,
same.
yeah, I love the seesaw, the accessible seesaw really was one that stood up for me in the orphanage. Like who really that really takes innovation. And what really came to my mind was this is what it looks like when innovation and equity intersects and meets. I think there's so much potential and possibility when we can really, reimagine our world, and how do we think about AI and helping us solve some of these really complex problems that we have not been able to figure out yet, or really solve as humans. And I think we are at a place in society where we can leverage AI and not using existing biased data, but perhaps creating data that is equitable, that's rooted in principles of ethics and justice, so that we can think about more credible projects like Accessible World is doing, or like I Raise Girls and Boys is doing. And I'll share one of the offline, because I haven't patented the model yet, but I'm actually working on an accessible model around mental health.
Oh,
But
that's
this is,
great.
yeah, I'm excited about it.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. Oh
Yeah,
my
so
God.
excited about it, and excited about your work as well. Um, I'm wondering if we can close with some people may not be buying into anything we're saying right now, Slovena, and may be saying it's all either scary or not relevant to their lives, or maybe a number of other things that perhaps they're thinking. But I'm wondering if you can speak to why now this is important in our world, and then maybe just some things that parents and can do with their children to sort of prepare for some of these changes that will be coming in the evolving of AI.
Yeah. Oh, I love that question. So I think why now? Because it really does seem, at least to me, but I think to a lot of other people smarter as well, that this is going to be a transformational moment in our society. I mean, from every sector, education we covered, banking, employment, facial recognition. I think there's going to be changes coming, and it's just about educating and preparing ourselves for those changes. Of course, there's a role for governments, like we said, and private companies and NGOs as well. But I think that now is a good time to take small steps to familiarize yourself. So whether that's picking up a book, listening to a podcast, watching more of these fireside chats that you'll be doing. I think it's a good moment. And on the question of parents engaging with their kids, I love that question because I have a 11-year-old cousin, and the other day she told me she was using our version of Chat GPT. We have a Bulgarian version of it, Beged GPT, which is awesome. It's publicly funded, it's free, it's great. So she said she'd used it for an assignment, and I said to her, okay, but you can use it to like research and kind of find things out, but you can't use it to copy paste. And she said, yeah, of course I know. And I said, oh, okay. So I think it's about interacting and just having conversations about acceptable use and like, what does this mean? And like kids will surprise us. I mean, I was certainly surprised when she said that. So I think just talking about it is the best way to start.
I love that. I have a 12-year-old, and I'm thinking about needing to have these conversations with her as well. Especially again, we briefly touched on like deep fakes, but there are some things out there online that we do need to protect our children from. But I do think we need to really approach this with some curiosity, so we can learn, as well as safety, of course, at the core of everything we're doing with our children. But I think curiosity will help us to really deepen our understanding of what's going on in the AI world. And so I appreciate you, Slovena, for all of your work and for joining us today, for sharing your incredible insights on tech policy, democracy, your work in EU, in Bulgaria. And I'm wondering if people are interested in either reaching out to you to follow your work here at Harvard or your work with Accessible World. How can they reach you?
Of course. I'm easy to find on LinkedIn, so I'm super happy to connect on there. And as for Accessible World, we're on every single social media platform. So you can look up Accessible World Foundation on LinkedIn, on Facebook, or Accessible WF on Twitter or Instagram. So we'd love to have everyone staying in the loop and sharing ideas and sharing their own work. It's really a community, so it would be great to hear from people out there.
Love that. And I'm going to be following up myself. This is incredible. I think Accessible World is not just needed in EU, but I think it's needed here. So Professor Anthony Fox, he was the former Secretary of Transportation. Not sure if you met him yet, Slovena, but
I've heard of him. Yeah, I've heard of I know he's around. Yes.
Might want to book some time with him, talk about your work. Yeah. I also think he's worked on some global things in the White House as well.
Oh, very good.
Yeah. So this was great. We talked about AI, Artificial Intelligence Act in EU. We talked about education and digital divide and how to just be a part of what's going on in this new world. And Slovena, you've brought such incredible insights. So I want to thank you once again for diving deep and for sharpening our understanding of this work. Hope to have you back, and I hope to hopefully find ways to support your work, Accessible World, and see if there are future ways that we can collaborate with our worlds together. Thank you.
Absolutely. I would love that. And thank you so much for having me. And best of luck with all the wonderful work you're doing. It's really, really impressive. So I can't wait to see how it develops more.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Slovena. And thank you to all those that have tuned in, that have watched. If you need to watch this video again for more understanding, please do that. We also want you to share it out, as mentioned earlier. We are really focused on ensuring that people receive these messages that we're highlighting on this platform to educate, to amplify, and to empower our communities to prepare for reaching their full potential. And so we hope that this message has helped you, has inspired you. And if it has, please go ahead and share it out. Again, thank you so much for tuning in, for watching us. Don't forget to follow us at www.iraceinc.org.